Benedicite Dominus. Welcome to question 143 of the Secunda Secundae. The topic for this lecture is the parts of temperance, and I am Dr. Thibault. So whenever we do a new cardinal virtue, we always we introduce the virtue, we introduce the vice, and then we get into the parts associated with it. So this, like all the other virtues, is no different. We should be used to it by now if you've been watching from the beginning to end. So the parts of temperance, there are always within these virtues three distinct parts. There are the integral parts, the subjective parts, and the potential parts of any virtue, moral virtue. The description I'm using, the image I'm using, is taken from Prudence. When in the virtue of prudence, we talked about the parts that introduced this imagery. So I think it's very helpful imagery. So if you'd like to read it yourself, you can go back to question 48. Read it yourself. But the integral parts of a virtue are those which are necessary for the virtue. Green screening out here. They're necessary parts of the virtue. The virtue doesn't exist without them. And the example given is of a house. So the integral parts of a house are the walls, the floor, the roof, the doors, the windows, but they are essential elements of it. So you could say, well, I have a house. Well, do you have a roof? No. Do you have walls? No. Do you have the floor? No. Well, then you don't have a house. Right? If you're missing pieces of it, it stops being the whole. So in that way, the integral parts are the elements of it. If anybody has studied law, you talk about the elements of a crime. So burglary, for example, is breaking and entering with the intention of committing a felony at night. So it has to be, you have to break something, you have to enter in, it has to be at night, it has to be a dwelling, and you have to be intentionally committing a felony. So if one of those pieces is missing, it's not burglary, for example. So these are these elements of temperance. They have their own parts that make up what temperance is. We also then have the subjective parts. And I apologize for anyone who already knows all this, but somebody might not have seen all of the videos. Subjective parts are parts that have to deal with kind of like a species. So if we were to say animal, for example, as the umbrella term, we have within the term animal, we have things like lions and ox and goats and dogs, right? A dog is not a lion, which is not a goat. If all the goats on the planet die off, animals still exist, unlike a house, right? The integral parts. If you lack the walls, you don't have a house anymore, probably. Or you don't have a roof, you probably don't have a house. If we don't have lions, we still have animals, right? Even if there were only one species of animal left on the planet, you would still have animals. Even if you had one animal left on the planet, animal would exist, right? So these are not dependent terms in the same way. So these are parts of temperance which are related to each other because they have certain characteristics in common under the umbrella term of temperance. Temperance is a cardinal virtue. It inspires these other virtues, but they're not directly related. There's some type of relationship, an indirect relationship, but they aren't perfectly related. And temperance could exist without them. Frankly, it could exist without them, unlike integral parts where temperance can't exist without them. And then the potential parts. When you think of potential, we often think of things that is like maybe, right? Are you going to go to the movies tonight? Potentially, maybe, right? This is a different understanding than what St. Thomas means and Aristotle means with potential um, virtues. Potential virtues are secondary virtues. They're virtues in and of themselves, but they support, like, think of potential like something that's potent. Like I always say, like natural ginger ale. If you ever had natural ginger ale, you take a sip, you get knocked back. It's not like the stuff you get, the Seagrams. It's not like that. It's not potential. It's something that has a kick. Right? It gives it power. It has strength behind it. This is what we mean by potential powers, and they strengthen. They bolster up temperance. Uh, could temperance exist without it? Sure, but it wouldn't be as powerful of a virtue if it didn't have these secondary virtues supporting it. Right? So that's what these uh, potential powers, potential virtues are. They're annexed to it, but they can't exist without it. They don't. They like a flying buttress on the wall of a cathedral. You could just have a flying buttress. Right? Flying buttress would stand up on its own. The cathedral wouldn't stand up without the buttress, but the buttress could stand up without the cathedral. Similarly here. So when we look at these integral parts, when we look at all the parts, we're going to go all into them specifically, question by question, in the next 27 questions. So I won't go into great detail here, kind of clumping them together. So when we look at the integral parts, we have shamed face, which sounds a little bit negative, right? Shamed face. If somebody said, "Oh, you're so shamed face," I whenever somebody calls you whatever face, it's not usually good, right? Little kids say, stupid face or something like that, right? It's not typically good to be a face, but this is a virtue. So shamed faced is one that recoils when they hear something contrary to temperance. You could, anybody who's kind of serious in the spiritual life or virtuous life, you probably have experienced this, if you're at work or somewhere where probably not your friends, right? Because you choose your friends, but you don't always choose who you work with. You're in the break room and somebody's taking the Lord's name in vain, or they're talking about something overtly sexual or objectifying or something like this. You might just kind of recoil at it, right? You kind of, why did they have to say that? You could have said it another way. Why do you have to say it like that? Or why do you have to take the Lord's name in vain? Not even a you're not even a religious person and you're going to blaspheme Christ's name, and just say something else, right? A shamefaced person recoils at that. And, to listen to um, music, I guess on the radio they're probably censored, but if you listen to the uncensored version of music that's on the radio, you will inevitably recoil if you were a temperate person. My formation director once said, "Not for pious ears," right? Not for pious ears. Uh, that's how you react to things you hear when you're shamefaced. The other one is honesty, which is a love for the beauty of temperance. I love that imagery there, beauty of temperance. Von Balthasar would love the aesthetics, virtue as aesthetics. And why live a virtuous life? Because the virtuous life is beautiful. Right? Isn't that so much nicer than, why do you follow the virtuous life? Because I have a duty, right? Very Kantian way of looking at it. I have a duty. You know, why do you follow the good? Because it's beautiful and it's true. Right? That's, I love it. Right? That I think is lovely. And this other word that we've used before, but comeliness, right? That's that kind of cold glass of lemonade on a hot day, a fresh, cool breeze on an otherwise hot, humid, stifling uh, day. It's a sense of peace and refreshment. It's pleasant to be around, right? Homeliness, right? That's that honesty of temperance. Beautiful imagery. Now, the subjective parts are, again, these are elements of under the umbrella, right? Like the lion and the ox are parts of animals. These are parts of temperance. Well, how one relates to meat. Uh, we could say all food. Probably today, probably junk food would be perhaps a better term than meat. But St. Thomas says meat because at the time you would have had to have been a very affluent person to be eating meat, most likely. So to abstain from meat would be that balance. Balance. And if you recall back from the last question, it's not insensibility. It's not that you don't enjoy these pleasures because pleasure itself is evil. That's not the point. You might abstain in order to live a more balanced life, to refocus on some of the things that matter more, penance or contemplation or athletics or being a soldier. Um, that kind of temperance related to drink is sobriety. In terms of sex, chastity, right? Sexual relationships remain within the context of your marriage. If you're not married, that you remain celibate. That would be part of chastity. And then St. Thomas goes into these other sexual acts, which would be kissing and all the other physical things that aren't sex but um, are sexual in nature. And he was purity. Purity is the temperance, the virtue of temperance that would balance that. So again, we will get into all of these in future questions. And then we get into the potential parts. Remember, these are the ones that give strength. They bolster up temperance. Uh, well, we have constancy, which is not succumbing to immoderate concupiscence. Uh, and then we have meekness, which restrains anger and the desire for revenge. This is in terms; these are in terms of like the inner disposition of the person, right? And if one has a sense of modesty, which is then later on broken down to humility, it's restraint from the daring, this unmoderated hope that yeah, I can jump over that hole in the ground. The person falls back in because no, they can't. Right? The restraint from being daring would be modesty, and then St. Thomas spends a short paragraph going over the ancient philosophers' versions of modesty and what's in modesty, what's out of modesty. Some of that, sure, having modesty requires having the right order of things. Holding things in the right order is always part of the virtuous life. And then in terms of relationships, having modesty, one should have a certain decorum, a certain amount of self-respect, and within conversations, a certain gravity to it. Saint Benedict, the rule of Saint Benedict often talks about this kind of gravity. Because once we get into these kind of informal conversations, then people start teasing and joking and making fun of, and then before you know it, people are talking about all types of things. So having a certain gravitas, right, gravity within relationships, um, is part of modesty, not being too loose-lipped. But this will be questions 165 through 170. There's 5 questions dedicated to this at the end of this section, so I won't go into too much detail here. This is the overview. Just know there is a lot more to be said about that and all of the above parts. So in conclusion, the parts of temperance are the integral parts, the subjective parts, and the potential parts. This is the same as all moral virtues. We see this over and over again. So next we will start getting into the integral parts of temperance.